Hello guys and welcome back to my channel. Apologies for the background, I don't normally do these videos here but I'm having to use this space at the moment, so hopefully you'll bear with me. And today I'm going to talk about not just one case but several, all surrounding the same individual. So I'm doing this following a new documentary in the UK that was released on Channel 4 last night, which was the 9th of June, called In the Footsteps of Killers. In this documentary, Professor David Wilson and Amelia Fox look into unsolved cold British cases. And in this case, they were looking into the murders of two boys, which has been referred to as the Milk Carton Kids, as they were the first children in the UK whose pictures were ever featured on milk cartons sold at Iceland. So the boys we're talking about are David Spencer and Patrick Warren. They're 11 and 13 years old and we're going back to 1996. It's Boxing Day. So David and Patrick, Paddy to his friends, go outside on that Boxing Day, and Paddy has with him his new red Apollo bike that he'd got just the day before for Christmas, was very excited about it, so he took it outside to play. These boys were best friends and they lived in a working class area of Chelmsley Wood in Birmingham. Now, from everything I've read and from the documentary last night, it seemed that the boys were your typical young, mischief-filled young boys. They were known around the neighbourhood. I get the impression that they perhaps had made a bit of a pest of themselves. Everyone knew who they were, and at one stage it did say that the police were aware of them. So, not that that has any sway whatsoever on this case. It's just typical little boys from a local estate, hung out together all the time. And on this specific Boxing Day evening, now I've heard two different stories in this. In the documentary I watched last night, it said that each of the boys lied to their parents and said that they were staying at the other boy's house. I do apologise if you hear children screaming, it's why I'm in this half of the house. It's just madness out the front of our house, which is a bit sad given what we're talking about, children playing. So these two boys are out Boxing Day, best friends, Chelmsley Wood in Birmingham. And they've lied to their parents. Each is saying that they're staying at the other's house. Now, what I read online said that Patrick had said he was going to visit one of his brothers, so I'm not entirely sure which one of those is the case. It's kind of irrelevant. Basically, both sets of parents thought the boys were somewhere else. So the last sighting of the boys is just after midnight, so we're on to now the 28th, the day after Boxing Day, and they had spent some time at a local petrol station. The actual lady that worked there was interviewed in the documentary last night, and she did talk about speaking to them, and they were just there chatting, and they made it quite clear to her that they were hungry, and she actually bought them a packet of biscuits to share. And she said she saw them walk across the way and they sat down on some steps and they were sharing the biscuits together. Now at this time it was late at night, the petrol station itself was closed, but it had the little hatch for people to come up and maybe purchase things. They wouldn't come into the store, but she would like sell things through the hatch. And that hatch had a microphone so that you could hear people outside and what they were asking for. So when interviewed, she'd said if there was a major commotion or anyone shouted or screamed or anything loud happened, she would most definitely have heard it. But the next time she looked round at the area where the boys had been, they had vanished, they'd gone, and she just assumed they'd gone on their way. So it's the next morning, it's a day after Boxing Day, and the boys' parents, both sets, are beginning to realise that where are our sons, where's David, where's Paddy, and they make a report to the local police. Now it seems at that time, both from the documentary and from my reading, that the police really did not take this very seriously. There was a number of hours between this being reported to the police and them actually coming out to talk to them. And then after that, several days before actual full statements were taken, the police described these boys as very streetwise, and they treated it pretty much like a runaway case, like they were just up to mischief. They'd taken themselves off somewhere and they would come home, and this is a direct quote, the boys will come home when they're hungry. The boys' mothers knew this wasn't the case, but what they thought would make sense or would stand out to the police is that Paddy's new bike, his new red Apollo bike, was actually left behind that petrol station. So when they'd been in, they'd got the biscuits, he'd left it outside the shop and he'd never went to retrieve it. It was still sitting there at the back of the shop where he'd left it. So that is not something Paddy was going to do with this brand new bike. It was his pride and joy, it's something he really wanted. So that in itself should have been enough for the police to pay a little bit more attention to this case. Now in the documentary last night they do talk about a suspect in this case. This case went for many, many years. They had investigations, they interviewed numerous people, but they never really come up with any concrete proof or evidence of what happened to the boys. Nothing was found of them, no items belonging to them, no clothes. Their bodies have never been recovered. The families were absolutely 100% sure that the boys would have been in touch with them if they had run away or been playing a prank, and they wouldn't have allowed their families to worry in that way. Obviously they said, no, they haven't run away, something has happened, but even when pushed, if that was the case, if they ran away, they would have been in touch by now. So the parents are very much sure that something has happened to both Paddy and David. So we have one major suspect. All we have about this person is that they were living and working in the area near to where the boys went missing at this time. Now, there was information that one police officer said that he had that made him pretty sure that this individual was who they were looking for, but they had no physical proof. But they couldn't release to this documentary show what that actual evidence was, as it was an ongoing investigation. The individual that they are looking at for the disappearance of these boys is currently serving time in prison for another case. It seems when we look into this individual's past, Brian Field, it just opens an entire can of worms. I'm going to attempt to tell you a little bit about Brian Field and what he's done. This may omit some information because it is so extensive. This guy looks like quite possibly he could be the biggest unknown child killer in the whole of the UK. That was said in the documentary last night, and what this guy has been up to, what he's done, it just would make your toes curl. So let's talk about Brian Field. So Brian Field was born Brian Lull in 1936 and born in Lincolnshire. He was actually given up for adoption the day after his birth by his mother, who was a sex worker, and he was adopted and lived with 12 other foster boys. His new father, Paul Field, was actually honoured by the Queen for his work with children, and he even actually appeared with his family on an old episode of This Is Your Life back in the day. In 1959, Brian joined the Royal Marines, where he spent 2 years in Malta and Cyprus, and it said that here was his first, it describes it as homosexual encounter. Now, I don't know if this means with someone of the same age. It doesn't go into any detail, but this is perhaps where he discovered his sexual preference. So Brian actually married twice. His first wife was called Celia, and she died in a road traffic accident in 1966. After that, Brian went on to marry again for a second time, and his second wife is said to have divorced him after it came to the attention of the police about his sexual interest in young boys. So by this stage it's 1968. Brian's first wife Celia had died in 66. He was now settled in Thames Ditton in Surrey, where he worked as an engineer for the Milk Marketing Board. And it's in 1968 that one of the first major occurrences happens. So it's the 23rd of April 1968. Brian has just had some time off work because his wife has just given birth to a new baby. The baby's not even 2 weeks old and he's due to be back at work. It's his first day back. And on this day he has been drinking heavily with some work colleagues. I would assume quite possibly in celebration of him having a new child. But he's actually driving, yes, driving to London in his white Mini. At the same time, 14-year-old Roy Tutill is leaving Kingston Grammar School. He comes from a very normal household. He has a sister called Margaret and a brother called Colin. His school is 15 miles away from his home. He always wanted to hitchhike home to try and possibly save some money on the bus fare because he really wanted a new bike and some model trains, but his parents had said to him that you can't hitchhike home until you're 14. His older brother Colin was allowed to do this as he was older, so Roy was just really excitedly anticipating his 14th birthday, which was that March, so that he could possibly save a little bit of money to put towards the little things that he wanted. So as I say, it was April 23rd, almost a month after Roy has turned 14, and he did buy a bus ticket that day for 8 pence, and he got off the bus early, hoping to save the rest of the money for the rest of that journey and hitchhike the rest of the way home. This is unfortunately where Roy encounters Brian Field, who, as I've already said, has been drinking heavily. He's driving his white Mini in the vicinity and he spots Roy at the side of the road thumbing for a lift and he pulls over. Now he tells Roy that he promises he'll drop him off further down the road on his way, but when Roy gets into the car, Brian leans over and touches his leg. He makes it very clear he is not going to be compliant, and this enrages Brian, who pulls over into a lay-by, orders Roy to strip and sexually assaults him. Then, for some reason, Brian drives to another lay-by, a separate lay-by, where he actually strangles Roy with a piece of rope. He describes completely, with no emotion, how Roy's body convulsed as he struggled to breathe, and just suddenly he just went lifeless, he died. Brian simply put Roy into the boot of his car and drove back home to his wife and his not yet 2-week-old new child. Roy's body would be found 3 days later in local woodland owned by newspaper tycoon Lord Beaverbrook. He was found still wearing his skull blazer and his satchel was very close by. His body was covered in cuts and bruises and his own nail marks were around his neck, showing the desperate struggle that Roy had put up trying to pull the rope from around his own throat when Brian was strangling him. The case obviously dominated the front pages of newspapers for weeks to come, and the police interviewed up to 10,000 people and took more than 2,000 statements. Intimate samples were taken from Roy's fingernails and from his clothes, but obviously we're talking 1968 here. And all they could do was determine that the perpetrator was either type A or type O blood group. So upon questioning, the police actually discovered that Roy had actually been seen getting into the Mini, but the witness had actually mistaken the type of car he got into for a completely different make, so this was never actually discovered. So police were led down a blind alley. Meanwhile, Brian Field continues to offend as if absolutely nothing happened. So on November 12th, 1969, he appears at Wrexham Court, where he's convicted and fined for gross indecency following passing lewd notes to an undercover police detective in a public lavatory. In November 1972, at Aberdeen Sheriff's Court, he is convicted and sentenced to 2 years for the assault of a 14-year-old boy. On that occasion, he actually pounced on a young boy walking up a very quiet country lane, ordered him to strip from the waist down, assaulted him and then just released him, allowed him to go on his way. In April 1982, he was fined for gross indecency at Oswestry Magistrates Court for fondling a young 17-year-old boy. In September 1983 at Shrewsbury Crown Court, he was jailed for 4 years after being convicted of 2 counts of buggery. And at Stafford Crown Court in June 1986, he was jailed for a further 4 years for the false imprisonment of 2 young teenage boys. I think you can see Field made a habit of moving around quite a lot and was never out of prison for very long before he reoffended, and the offences were always of a very similar nature. The boys he was convicted of false imprisonment were 13 and 16 years old, and that he threatened them with a wheel brace. He ordered them to undress in his car, and the boys escaped by quite simply jumping from a moving car and endangering their lives, but it's what saved them. And this case is the only situation in the UK that anyone has ever been known to attempt a double abduction, 2 boys at the same time, which does ring very similar bells to David and Paddy, who we're talking about, the Milk Carton Kids. So, but as time went on, something changed. By the mid-1990s, DNA technology was much more advanced than it had been many years ago, and someone could simply touch something and DNA sample could be obtained from something as simple as their sweat. So due to this new technology, a sample from that original case back in 1968 was able to be placed on the database in 1996. Field probably realised at this time that this could possibly be his downfall, so he was trying to live very quietly and peacefully in Solihull in the West Midlands at the time. Field had not been arrested for 13 years at this stage when, in September 1999, he was pulled over for drink driving, no less. He was made give a swab at the scene, and this swab came back as a match to the DNA sample held on the database for the murder of Roy Tutill back in 1968. Field was arrested at his home in Solihull on February 21st, 2001, but he claimed to know absolutely nothing about the killing or anything regarding it. But the DNA evidence obviously doesn't lie, and when it became clear that he was going to be convicted for buggery, he came forward and admitted the murder. He admitted everything. His arrest obviously brought a lot of closure to Roy's surviving family that had been waiting for the monster that did this to Roy to be caught for so long. Unfortunately, Roy's parents both died before this happened, so they did not see this monster brought to justice. So when Field was actually sentenced at the Old Bailey, Judge Gerald Gordon had something to say. I'm just going to read from this. It's a quote so as not to get it wrong. "This was the killing of a normal, happy, healthy boy. An act particularly obnoxious for all right-minded people. But your crime goes much further than that. Having taken a just 14-year-old boy away in your car to satisfy your sexual urges, you then committed forceful, dreadful sexual acts, and shortly thereafter you strangled him, almost certainly with a rope. You dumped him in the boot of your car and returned home to your wife and young son. 2 days later, you discarded his body. These acts and the consequence must have haunted his parents for the rest of their lives. The rest of his family and friends must still suffer for what you did. Modern science techniques have led to your conviction and stand as a warning that there are few, if any, hiding places for sexual and violent criminals from modern techniques." Speaking outside the court, Superintendent Philip Doyle said that the one regret they had is that they didn't catch him sooner and possibly stop what happened to a lot of other young boys. So let's go back to the Milk Carton Kids. At the time when they went missing, Field was actually living in Solihull, very close to where this happened. He's the only man in the UK ever to have been convicted of abducting more than one boy, 2 at the same time. The age also fits in with the age of the boys that he was targeting. Officers are actually believed to have visited Field in prison and questioned him extensively, but he still completely denies any accountability, anything to do with this case. Police actually have still said that early indicators showed that the boys had planned to run away. That still doesn't sit right with me. The bike that was abandoned, nothing pointed towards that. So in relation to that, Chief Superintendent Gordon Fraser from the West Midlands Police has actually commented on that also. He said that during 2 days of questioning under caution, Field had denied any involvement in the boy's disappearance. He said there are many lines of inquiry. We may interview Field again, and until we establish what happened to David and Patrick, we cannot rule him out. They've been missing for 10 years. We have made many appeals for them to come forward and they have not done so. I have no evidence to believe that they are still alive. He went on to say they are also still questioning other sexual predators who lived in that area around the time of their disappearance. The case was actually reopened again in 2006 due to advances in technology, and I think I have a quote from that as well. Chief Superintendent Fraser said, "There have been huge developments in policing techniques and technology in the past 10 years, and I am keen to use these to shine a 2006 torch to a 1996 incident. The investigation focused mainly on the local community, where the police took statements from about 300 people and did an extensive leaflet drop in the local area. There have also been local areas of interest dug up in a search for the boys, but as yet nothing has been found. The families are still very insistent that Paddy and David did not run away, that something has definitely happened to them. And for me, that individual being in that area and his past, and there are more instances. There actually was one that was covered last night in the documentary, which was just haunting. His poor parents were interviewed. It nearly brought me to tears watching the father especially being interviewed. This is the case of Mark Billington. It occurred in 1984. He was 15 years old. Again, Field was in the local area and Mark was actually found hanging from a tree. There was no sign that he was suicidal, no sign that he wanted to do this, a happy, normal boy. And an actual expert was interviewed and said that the knots that were used in the noose that hung the boy were much too complicated and much too professional almost for a young boy to have been able to do. His parents 100%, my son didn't kill himself, this is not the case. But this has never actually been fully investigated as a murder case, and unfortunately, even though now we have the DNA of Brian Field, at that time, because it was not considered a murder inquiry, the police were under no obligation to keep his clothes, the rope, anything from that time. And although his parents always thought the police had that all of these items on file, which they did have at one time. These have been lost over the years, and the police have very simply said, well, it's not an active murder investigation, so we're under no obligation to keep these objects. And if their son was murdered, which they are 100% sure was the case, those items of clothing and the rope could actually contain DNA of the perpetrator. And now, these days, if that was Brian Field, we could tie those together and we could give Mark's parents answers. We could tell them what happened to their son. So that is the case of the Milk Carton Kids, Roy Tutill, Mark Billington and Brian Field. Many other teenage boys that he is responsible for completely ruining their lives. Is it possible that he is responsible for the disappearance of David and Paddy? It certainly looks like it fits his profile. He was in the area at the time. He's the only person to have ever attempted to abduct 2 boys at one time. The age fits. And in the documentary it was alluded to that someone had actually seen Brian talk to the 2 boys several days before they actually disappeared. So everything certainly seems to point towards Brian Field. He is serving a life sentence at the moment and he will never be released from prison. The police have said, you've got nothing to lose. If you were responsible, tell us. Give the family closure. But to this day, Brian Field denies all knowledge, says he's not responsible, and the existing family members have been given no peace of mind. They still don't know what happened to David or Paddy after that Boxing Day. So thank you for watching, guys. You can let me know in the comments below your thoughts on this. Did you see the documentary? What did you think? This documentary is going to run in several parts, so we will have a different case next week. That will be on the 16th of June, so on Wednesday evening, I think 9 o'clock on Channel 4. And I shall be back talking about whatever case is covered in next week's documentary. Thank you for watching, guys. Over and out from Lisa Lives.